Hello, everyone. I am Mr. X Black. I am here to help you today. I know you watch videos before sleeping. So before that, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment. Where are you from? And what time are you watching? Let's relax with me at horror stories with rain sounds and black-green save energy. Have a good night. My name is Dr. Thomas Blackwood. I was the sole survivor of the White Ridge expedition to Mount Erebus in February of 2023. What I'm about to share with you has been classified by the Department of Wildlife Services, but the truth must be told. If you're planning any excursion into the northern wilderness, you need to hear this, because what happened to us wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a hunt, and we were the prey. 9 of us set out from White Ridge Base Camp on what should have been a routine mapping expedition of the eastern face of Mount Erebus. Our team consisted of myself, the medical officer, Sarah Chun, our lead climatologist, Marcus Delaney, our guide with 15 years of mountain experience, the Jensen twins, Eric and Elise, both expert climbers, Dr. Rodriguez, our wildlife biologist, Cameron Hayes, our communications specialist, Jason Murphy, our equipment technician, and Professor Helen Walsh, the expedition leader, renowned for her study of glacial retreat patterns. We'd all heard the stories about Mount Erebus, the missing hikers, the strange tracks, the sounds in the night that couldn't be explained by wind or wildlife. But we were scientists, rational minds. We dismissed these as tall tales meant to scare tourists and amateurs away from dangerous terrain. God, how wrong we were. Our first 3 days on the mountain were uneventful. The weather held, unusually mild for February. We established our primary camp at the 8,000-foot mark, with plans to send smaller teams to various survey points over the following week. On the 4th night, the temperature dropped suddenly. Not gradually as you'd expect, but as if someone had thrown a switch. 30 degrees in under an hour. The wind picked up, howling through our camp like a living thing in pain or rage. I remember Professor Walsh looking up from her data readings with concern. "This isn't normal," she said. "These patterns don't match any weather system I've ever studied." That was the first time I felt it. A prickling at the back of my neck. A sense that we were being observed. Cameron tried to radio back to base camp, but all we got was static. He blamed it on the sudden storm, but I saw the confusion in his eyes. Our equipment was top of the line, designed to function in the harshest conditions. None of us slept well that night. The wind made sounds, almost like words, almost like warnings. I was awakened just before dawn by Marcus shaking my shoulder roughly. "Thomas, get up. Something's wrong." The urgency in his voice had me instantly alert. Outside our tents, the storm had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The kind of silence that feels heavy, pregnant with threat. "It's Jason," Marcus said. "He went to check the perimeter sensors about 2 hours ago. He should have been back by now." We woke the others, and Eric volunteered to check Jason's last known location with Marcus. They suited up and headed out, promising to radio in every 15 minutes. The first call came right on schedule. Nothing unusual to report. The second call, Marcus's voice was different. Tense. "We've found tracks," he said, his voice crackling through the radio. "Large tracks. Much bigger than anything I've ever seen. Definitely your sign, but wrong somehow." "Wrong how?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, grabbing the radio. "The gate. The size a bear this size would be." Marcus's voice trailed off. "Would be what?" Rodriguez pressed. "At least 12 feet tall when standing. Maybe more." We all exchanged looks. There was no bear species on record that reached those dimensions. "And there's something else," Eric cut in. "There are other tracks mixed in with the bears. Human tracks. Jason's, we think. But they're running. And the stride length suggests he was running fast. The implication hung in the air like a physical presence. "Get back here. Now," Professor Walsh ordered. "Wait," Marcus said. "We found something." It looks like Jason dropped his. The radio erupted with a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream. Something between the two. Something that shouldn't exist in nature. Then Eric's voice, panicked. Run, run. Oh God, The radio went dead. We tried repeatedly to re-establish contact with Marcus and Eric. Nothing. Professor Walsh made the decision to send a search party. Herself, Rodriguez, and Cameron, while the rest of us secured the camp and prepared emergency medical supplies. They'd been gone less than an hour when Elise, who had been watching through binoculars, suddenly gasped. Something's coming. Fast. I looked where she was pointing. A figure was stumbling through the snow toward our camp. As it drew closer, I recognized Cameron. He was alone, and he was running as if the devil himself were at his heels. When he reached us, he collapsed. His face was bloodless, his breathing ragged. His parka was torn, and there was blood on his gloves. Not his own, he later told us. It took several minutes to calm him enough to speak coherently. What he described made my blood run cold. They'd followed the tracks to a narrow ravine about a mile from camp. There, they found signs of a struggle and alarming amounts of blood in the snow. As they were examining the scene, they heard movement from a cave entrance partially hidden by an outcropping of rock. Professor Walsh approached cautiously, calling out Marcus's and Eric's names. There was no response, but the movement continued. She signaled Rodriguez to ready the tranquilizer rifle, standard equipment for expeditions where wildlife encounters were possible. It came out so fast, Cameron whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused as he relived the moment. 1 second there was nothing, and the next, this thing burst out of the darkness. He described a massive bear, but wrong in ways that defied easy explanation. Its fur was patchy, revealing gray skin beneath that looked almost necrotic. Its face was asymmetrical, one eye larger than the other, both burning with an intelligence that seemed impossible for an animal. And its mouth. Cameron kept returning to its mouth, which he said was too wide, too full of teeth. All wrong. It had taken Rodriguez with the first swipe, nearly cutting him in half. Professor Walsh had fired the tranquilizer, but the dart seemed to have no effect. The creature had turned on her next. She told me to run, Cameron said, his voice breaking. She screamed at me to run back to camp, to warn everyone. The last thing I saw was, it had her by the. He couldn't finish. Elise, Sarah, and I looked at each other, the same realization dawning on all of us simultaneously. 5 of our team were now dead or missing. We were alone on the mountain with something that shouldn't exist. And night would be falling again in a few hours. We barricaded ourselves in the largest tent, bringing in all the supplies we could carry. Sarah tried repeatedly to contact base camp, but the radio remained stubbornly silent. Our satellite phone was similarly dead, showing full battery, but no signal. We have to leave, Elise insisted. We need to get down the mountain before nightfall. She was right, of course, but the reality of our situation made that nearly impossible. The fastest route down would take us at least 8 hours in good conditions. With a storm threatening and unknown terrain between us and safety, trying to navigate after dark would be suicide. We stay put, I decided. We secure the perimeter, set up the wildlife deterrents, and we wait for morning. Sarah nodded in agreement. First light, we make a run for it. Cameron had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, likely in shock. Elise checked our weapons, a flare gun, Rodriguez's backup tranquilizer pistol with limited darts, and the various knives and tools we had among us. Not much against what we were facing. As the light began to fade, the temperature dropped again, and the wind returned with its unsettling, almost voice quality. Sarah, who had been monitoring our weather equipment, looked up with a furrowed brow. It doesn't make sense, she said. These patterns, it's like the weather is being manipulated somehow. Directed. By what? I asked. She just shook her head. I don't know, but it's not natural. The first attack came just after full dark. We heard something circling the tent, breathing heavily. The snow crunched under its weight. Then, silence. We waited, barely breathing ourselves, weapons ready. The tent wall suddenly bulged inward as something massive pressed against it. The reinforced fabric, designed to withstand hurricane-force winds, strained and creaked. Through the thin material, I could make out a vague shape. Massive, standing upright. Then a sound. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to contain fragments of human speech. "It's trying to talk," Elise whispered, horrified. The pressure increased. The tent poles began to bend. Any second, they would snap. Sarah acted first, grabbing the flare gun and firing it directly at the shape through the tent wall. There was a flash of searing light, an inhuman scream, and the pressure disappeared. We heard it thrashing away through the snow, making those terrible almost speech sounds. Did you see it? Cameron had awakened and was staring wide-eyed at the scorched hole in the tent wall. Did you see its face? No, I said, moving to repair the damage as best I could. And I don't want to. I did, he whispered, just for a second in the flare light. It had Jason's eyes. None of us slept that night. The creature made several more passes around our camp, but didn't attempt another direct assault. Perhaps it was wary after being burned, or perhaps it was playing with us, enjoying our fear. As dawn approached, we prepared to make our escape. We packed only what was essential: water, some food, the remaining weapons, and first aid supplies. Our plan was simple: make a break for the tree line 2 miles down the slope, then follow the marked trail to the emergency shelter at the 6,000-foot mark. The morning was eerily calm and clear. No wind, no clouds, no sign of the creature. We moved quickly but cautiously, Sarah in the lead, me in the middle with the tranquilizer pistol, and Elise bringing up the rear, supporting Cameron, who was still weak from shock. We'd covered about half the distance to the tree line when Sarah suddenly stopped. "Look," she said, pointing to a dark opening in the mountainside about 50 yards off our route. "That's not on any of our maps." It was a cave entrance, partially obscured by snow but clearly visible in the morning light. And leading to it was a trail of dark spots in the snow. "Blood. We need to keep moving," Elise urged. "The shelter is our priority." But Sarah was already moving toward the cave, drawn by scientific curiosity or perhaps something more powerful. What if one of them is still alive? Marcus or Eric or... "Sarah, don't," I called, but she either didn't hear me or chose to ignore me. With a muttered curse, I followed her, signaling Elise to stay with Cameron. The cave entrance was larger than it had appeared from a distance. The blood trail led directly inside, fresh enough that it hadn't completely frozen. As my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I could make out a tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. "Sarah," I hissed, catching up to her just inside the entrance. She turned to me, her face pale but determined. "I heard something, Thomas." From deeper inside. It sounded like someone calling for help. I listened, but heard nothing except the faint drip of water somewhere in the darkness. "We need to go," I insisted, gripping her arm. "Whatever's in there." "Hello," she called into the darkness, ignoring my warning. "Is anyone there? Marcus? Eric?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, a voice responded. "Help, please." It was a human voice. Male, weak, and familiar. "That's Jason," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "He's alive." Before I could stop her, she was moving deeper into the cave, using her flashlight to guide her way. I had no choice but to follow. The tunnel descended steeply, opening into a larger chamber. The smell hit me first, the metallic tang of blood mixed with something putrid and wrong. Sarah's flashlight beam swept the space, and I wished immediately that it hadn't. The walls of the chamber were covered in claw marks and what looked disturbingly like writing, crude symbols carved into the stone. But it was what lay in the center of the room that froze the blood in my veins. It was Jason, or what remained of him. He was alive, barely, strapped to a crude stone slab with what looked like climbing ropes and equipment stripped from our own team. His chest had been opened. There's no other word for it. Open like a cabinet, ribs splayed outward, internal organs exposed but somehow still functioning. His eyes found us, registering recognition and terrible, pleading desperation. "Run," he managed to whisper through blood-flecked lips. "It's learning from us." A shadow moved at the back of the chamber. Something massive shifted in the darkness beyond the reach of Sarah's flashlight. "What is it learning, Jason?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking as she began to back toward the tunnel entrance, pulling me with her. Jason's next words came out as a gurgling whisper. "How to be human." The shadow lunged forward into the light. What we saw in that moment defies easy description, not because it was incomprehensible, but because the human mind rebels against such images. The creature was indeed a bear in its basic form, a massive grizzly that must have weighed over 1,000 pounds. But it was changing. Its front paws were elongating, the claws retracting, the pads flattening and splitting into crude approximations of fingers. Its hind legs were thickening, restructuring themselves to support an upright posture. And its face, God help me, its face was caught in a grotesque transition between ursine and human, with patches of fur falling away to reveal skin that crawled and shifted as if something lived beneath it. But the most horrifying aspect was its eyes, human eyes, transplanted or somehow grown into its skull, swiveling independently as they focused on us. I recognized those eyes. They had belonged to Professor Walsh. The thing opened its mouth, revealing rows of mismatched teeth, some bare, some unmistakably human, and it spoke, not in growls or animal sounds, but in words. Halting, malformed, but unmistakable English. "More parts," it said, its voice a hideous blend of animal growl and human articulation. "Need more to become." Sarah screamed then, the sound breaking the paralysis that had gripped me. I raised the tranquilizer pistol and fired all 3 remaining darts directly into the creature's chest. It roared, staggering backward, but didn't fall. The dosage that should have dropped a full-grown elephant merely slowed it. It looked down at the darts protruding from its chest, then back at us with something like curiosity in its stolen human eyes. "Chemical defense," it said, its voice becoming smoother, more coherent with each word. "Interesting." I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the tunnel. "Run." We sprinted back the way we had come, the creature's roars echoing behind us. I risked a glance back and saw it drop to all 4s to follow, still awkward in its partially transformed state, but terrifyingly fast. We burst out of the cave into the blinding daylight. Elise and Cameron were waiting exactly where we'd left them, their faces registering alarm at our panic. "Go," I shouted. "Run, now." We fled down the mountain, no longer following our planned route, but simply putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and the horror in the cave. The creature emerged from the cave behind us, rearing up on its hind legs in the sunlight, its misshapen silhouette casting a long shadow across the snow. It didn't immediately pursue us. Instead, it let out a sound that still haunts my dreams, a perfect imitation of Sarah's scream from moments before, but distorted, amplified, used as a hunting call. And from the surrounding peaks came answering calls. Not echoes, responses. It wasn't alone. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out beneath us. The tree line offered some cover, but also reduced visibility, both for us and, hopefully, for what pursued us. Cameron was the first to collapse, his earlier injuries and shock finally overwhelming him. Elise stayed with him while Sarah and I scouted ahead for any sign of the emergency shelter. "What was that thing?" Sarah asked as we paused to catch our breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "Some kind of mutation? An undiscovered species." She shook her head. "You saw it, Thomas. It was changing itself. Deliberately." using parts from our team. She looked at me, her eyes wide with the implications. It's not just killing for food. It's evolving, adapting, taking what it needs from us. But why? I asked, more to myself than to her. Why try to become human? Because we're at the top of the food chain, came Cameron's voice from behind us. He had regained consciousness and was leaning heavily on Elise as they caught up to us. It wants our position, our advantages. A chilling thought struck me. If there are more of them, and they're all doing this, then they're competing, Elise finished grimly. Evolving as fast as they can. An accelerated arms race. The distant sound of breaking branches silenced our speculation. They were coming. There, Sarah pointed. Through the trees, about a quarter-mile ahead, the metal roof of the emergency shelter was just visible. We moved as quickly as Cameron's condition would allow, reaching the shelter just as the sun began to dip toward the western peaks. It was a sturdy structure, essentially a reinforced cabin with a heavy metal door, stocked with emergency supplies, and, most importantly, a powerful radio. Elise secured the door while Sarah and I lowered Cameron onto one of the bunks. I assessed his condition: shock, exhaustion, minor frostbite, but no life-threatening injuries. Get the radio working, I told Sarah. It's our only hope. While Sarah worked on establishing contact with base camp, Elise and I took inventory of the shelter's supplies. Food and water for several days, a medical kit, and, to my immense relief, a high-powered rifle with ammunition, standard equipment for protection against conventional predators. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that seeped through the shelter's insulated walls. We kept the lights low, not wanting to advertise our presence more than necessary. "I've got something," Sarah said suddenly from the radio station. "It's weak, but it's there." We gathered around as she fine-tuned the frequency. Through bursts of static, a voice became audible, base camp responding to our distress call. Sarah quickly explained our situation, keeping to the essential facts. Expedition members dead, survivors trapped, hostile wildlife, urgent evacuation needed. "Help is on the way," came the crackled response. "Helicopter dispatched at first light. Can you mark your position?" "Affirmative," Sarah replied. "We have flares. We'll signal when we hear you approaching." The radio operator acknowledged and promised to maintain contact throughout the night. It should have been a moment of relief, but a sound from outside froze us in place. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the shelter. Not the movement of a normal quadrupedal animal, but the measured pace of something walking upright. Then came a voice, Professor Walsh's voice, perfectly replicated. "Sarah? Thomas? Are you in there? I need help. I'm injured." Elise's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. The thing had learned more than just speech. It had gained the ability to mimic specific voices. "Don't respond," I whispered. "It's trying to lure us out." The creature continued its psychological warfare, cycling through the voices of our dead teammates, pleading for help, describing horrific injuries, begging us to open the door. The performance was chillingly convincing. After several minutes, the vocal mimicry stopped, replaced by a sound that made my skin crawl. The metallic scrape of claws testing the shelter's walls, methodically searching for weaknesses. I loaded the rifle and positioned myself by the single window, a small, reinforced rectangle of glass that offered a limited view of the area immediately outside the door. "What if the helicopter doesn't come in time?" Cameron asked, his voice barely audible. Before I could offer any reassurance, there was a thunderous impact against the door. The entire shelter shook. The thing had abandoned subtlety. "It's trying to break in," Elise said unnecessarily, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. Another impact. The door held, but I could see the frame beginning to warp. "Thomas," Sarah called urgently from the radio. "Base camp says there's a storm moving in. The helicopter might be delayed." A third impact, harder than the previous two. A gap appeared between the door and frame. I raised the rifle. "Get the flare gun ready. If that door gives way..." The fourth impact tore the door partially from its hinges, creating an opening about 6 inches wide. Through it, I caught a glimpse of a grotesquely transformed paw, now more hand than animal appendage, gripping the edge of the door. I fired, the rifle's report deafening in the confined space. The creature withdrew with a roar of pain, but I knew it wouldn't retreat for long. "We need a plan," I said, reloading quickly. "We can't just wait for it to break through." Sarah's expression changed suddenly, a look of realization dawning. "The weather pattern," she said. "It's the same as before, dramatic temperature drop, directional wind." "Thomas, I don't think that storm is natural." "What are you saying?" Elise asked. "I'm saying these creatures might be able to influence the weather somehow, create conditions that isolate and trap their prey. If I'm right, that helicopter isn't coming anytime soon." Cameron, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Fire," he said. "Bears fear fire. Even, whatever these things are, might retain that instinct." It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. The emergency shelter contained several magnesium flares, the kind that burn at over 3,000 degrees and are nearly impossible to extinguish. If we could lure the creature into a confined space and ignite multiple flares simultaneously. We worked quickly, positioning ourselves and our makeshift weapons. Sarah and Cameron would remain inside, barricading the damaged door as best they could. Elise would station herself on the shelter's flat roof, accessible through a small hatch, with 2 flares and the rifle. I would become the bait, drawing the creature into the narrow space between the shelter and the rock face it was built against. As I prepared to go outside, Sarah gripped my arm. "This is insane, Thomas. It's too dangerous. We don't have a choice," I replied. "That door won't hold through another assault." With a final nod to my teammates, I slipped out through a small window on the side of the shelter away from where we'd last seen the creature. The night was clear and bitterly cold, the stars impossibly bright above the towering pines. I circled around to the front of the shelter, flare gun in one hand, hunting knife in the other. The creature was there, its back to me, still focused on the damaged door. In the moonlight, I could see how far its transformation had progressed. It stood fully upright now, its proportions a disturbing hybrid of bear and human. Patches of fur had given way to naked skin that glistened wetly in the moonlight. Its head remained predominantly ursine, but the profile had flattened, the snout shortening, the ears migrating to a more human position. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. It turned, faster than something of its size should be able to move. The face that confronted me will haunt me until my dying day. A bear's features molded by malevolent intelligence into a cruel parody of humanity. Professor Walsh's eyes stared out from that impossible face, recognition and hunger battling for dominance. "Thomas," it said, in a voice that was now a seamless blend of animal growl and human speech. "You will help us become." I fired the flare directly at it, the burning magnesium striking its chest. It roared in pain and rage, swatting at the sizzling material now burning into its flesh. I ran, not toward the dubious safety of the forest, but toward the narrow passage we'd designated as our killing ground. The creature, enraged and in pain, followed exactly as we'd hoped. "Now!" I shouted as I reached the position. Elise appeared on the roof edge above, rifle aimed. She fired twice in rapid succession, the bullets striking the creature's upper body. It staggered but didn't fall. I pressed myself against the shelter wall as the creature lunged into the narrow space after me. Elise dropped the 2 lit flares directly onto it from above. The magnesium ignited its fur instantly. The creature's roar transformed into something almost like a human scream. It thrashed wildly, trapped in the confined space, the flames spreading rapidly across its body. I scrambled away, back toward the shelter's door where Sarah was waiting to pull me inside. As I reached her, a burning paw hand gripped my ankle with impossible strength, dragging me back. I looked into those stolen human eyes, now filled with an all-too-human hatred, as the creature pulled me toward its burning form. "If we die," it said, its voice eerily calm despite its burning flesh, "you die too." Sarah grabbed my arms, engaging in a macabre tug-of-war for my life. The creature's grip was unbreakable, even as the flames consumed it. Then Elise was there, having descended from the roof. She swung the rifle like a club, smashing it against the creature's wrist. Something cracked, bone or the weapon itself, and the grip loosened just enough for Sarah to pull me free. We tumbled back into the shelter, slamming what remained of the door. Through the gap, we watched as the creature, fully engulfed in flames, staggered back and collapsed. But even as it burned, it continued to speak, its voice growing weaker but more human with each word. "Others, coming, learning, becoming. You cannot stop evolution." Its final sounds were not the death throes of an animal, but human laughter, Professor Walsh's laughter, perfect in every detail, that gradually faded to silence as the flames consumed what remained of its stolen humanity. The helicopter arrived shortly after dawn. The storm Sarah had feared never materialized, perhaps because the creature that might have summoned it was dead, or perhaps because her theory had been wrong all along. Some questions remain unanswered. The recovery team found no traces of our missing teammates except for scraps of equipment and alarming amounts of blood. The cave I described was located, but contained nothing except claw marks and crude symbols carved into the stone. No bodies, no evidence of the horrors we'd witnessed. The official report classified the incident as a wildlife attack, a rogue grizzly driven to unusual aggression by environmental factors. Our accounts of the creature's human-like qualities and abilities were attributed to trauma and extreme conditions. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what nearly killed me. DNA samples taken from the partially burned remains outside the shelter were inconclusive. Contaminated, they said, mixed with human DNA. They assumed cross-contamination in the lab. I know better. I've spent the past year researching similar incidents across the northern wilderness. Disappearances, unusual animal behavior, weather anomalies. I've found enough to convince me that what we encountered on Mount Erebus wasn't unique. There are others out there, learning, adapting, becoming. So let me leave you with this warning. If you venture into the wild places of this world, and you hear a voice calling for help, a human voice where no human should be, do not answer. Do not investigate. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because evolution has always been a race. And for the first time in history, we might not be winning.